Differences between standard error and standard deviation. Standard error versus standard deviation. Standard error is a measure of the variability or uncertainty in the estimate of a population parameter, such as mean, based on a sample. Whereas, standard deviation is the measure of the dispersion of the data values from the mean. The purpose of standard error is to provide a measure of precision of sample estimate. Whereas, the purpose of standard deviation is to measure the variability of data and frequently employ it to determine the volatility and risk of stocks. The synonym of standard error is standard error of mean, whereas the synonym of standard deviation is root mean square deviation. Standard error quantifies the precision of the sample mean as an estimate of the population mean, whereas standard deviation how spread out the data points are from the average. Standard error is represented by the symbol capital or small English letters, SE, and is typically denoted as SEX bar to indicate the standard error of sample mean. It is computed by dividing the standard deviation by square root of sample size. Whereas, standard deviation is represented by the symbol sigma for a population and S for a sample. It is computed by taking the square root of the variance, which is the average of the squared deviations from the mean. Formula 1 of population regarding standard error and standard deviation are given for comparison for ungrouped data. Formula 2 of sample regarding standard error and standard deviation are given for comparison for ungrouped data. Standard error measures the precision of sample mean estimate and reflects the uncertainty associated with estimating the population parameter. It is expressed in the same units as the original data but is typically presented alongside the mean estimate. Whereas, standard deviation measures the absolute dispersion of data points in the population or sample, providing insights into the variability within the dataset. It is expressed in the same units as the original data. Standard error is calculated using sample data and represents the variation or spread in sample means that would be obtained if multiple samples were drawn from same population. It estimates standard deviation of sampling distribution of sample mean, whereas standard deviation is calculated using all data points in a population or sample, taking into account their individual values in relation to the mean. It represents the average distance of data points from the mean. Standard error is used to assess and evaluate the precision of sample estimates, conduct hypothesis testing and confidence interval calculations, and make inferences about the population parameter based on sample data. Whereas, standard deviation is used to analyze, evaluate and compare the spread or variability of different datasets, identify outliers, assess the risk or volatility of investments, and evaluate the performance of statistical models. Standard error provides information about precision or reliability of the sample mean estimate, taking into account the variability of sample means that would be obtained from multiple samples drawn from same population. Whereas, standard deviation provides information about the variability or dispersion of data points within a dataset, indicating how much individual observations deviate from the mean. Standard error is useful for making inferences about the population mean based on the sample data. Whereas, standard deviation is useful for understanding the shape of distributions and the extent of data spread. Standard error is commonly used in inferential statistics, hypothesis testing, and estimation to quantify the precision and variability of sample means and make inferences about the population parameter. Whereas, standard deviation is commonly used in descriptive statistics, data analysis, and research to understand the spread of data and assess the variability within a population or sample. Standard error is an inferential statistic that estimates the variability of sample means and precision of sample mean estimate, useful for interpreting sample results and drawing the conclusions about population based on sample data. Whereas, standard deviation is a descriptive statistic that describes the spread of data points within a population or sample. It is applicable to both small and large sample sizes. Standard error is influenced by the sample size, as it decreases as the sample size increases. It reflects the precision of the sample mean estimate and becomes more accurate with larger sample sizes. Whereas, standard deviation is influenced by extreme values or outliers in the dataset, as it considers the individual values in relation to the mean. It is sensitive to changes in the dataset. The calculation of standard error involves dividing the standard deviation by the square root of the sample size. It reflects the variability of sample means that would be obtained from repeated sampling. Whereas, the calculation of standard deviation involves summing the squared differences between each data point and the mean, dividing by the number of data points and taking square root. Standard error is a measure of relative dispersion, providing information about the precision of the sample mean estimate and its relationship to the population mean. Whereas, standard deviation is a measure of absolute dispersion, providing information about the distribution of data points and their relationship to the mean. Standard error is used to calculate confidence intervals, perform hypothesis tests, and assess the significance of sample results. Whereas, standard deviation is used to calculate other statistical measures, such as z-scores, confidence intervals, and effect sizes. Standard error is typically presented as an estimated standard deviation of the sample mean and is often accompanied by the sample mean estimate. Whereas, standard deviation is typically presented as a single value that represents the overall variability within a dataset. Standard error is applicable to sample data and is used to estimate the variability of sample means that would be obtained if multiple samples were drawn from the same population. Whereas, standard deviation is applicable to both populations and samples, although separate formulas are used depending on whether the entire population or a sample is considered. Standard error can be used to assess the reliability and precision of a sample mean estimate by examining the variability of sample means obtained from repeated sampling. Whereas, standard deviation can be used to assess the reliability and stability of a measurement or observation by examining its consistency across repeated measurements. The value of standard error is influenced by the sample size, as it reflects the variability of sample means and decreases with larger sample sizes. Whereas, the value of standard deviation is influenced by the data points themselves, as it considers the deviations of individual observations from mean. Standard error provides insights into the precision of the sample mean estimate, allowing for inferences and statistical conclusions about the population parameter based on the sample data. Whereas, standard deviation provides insights into the data distribution, allowing for comparisons between datasets or assessment of the spread within a single dataset. Standard error is a measure of precision that can be used to interpret and draw inferences about the population mean based on sample means and their variability. Whereas, standard deviation is a measure of dispersion that can be used to summarize and interpret the spread of data points within a population or sample. Standard error is used in statistical analysis, hypothesis testing, survey research, and other fields where sample means are used to estimate population parameters and draw conclusions. Whereas, standard deviation is used in various fields, including statistics, finance, engineering, social sciences, and natural sciences, to analyze data and assess variability. Standard error helps to assess the precision and reliability of a sample mean estimate, indicating how close the sample mean is likely to be to the population mean. Whereas, standard deviation helps to identify and understand the distribution characteristics of a dataset, such as whether it is symmetrical, skewed, or has outliers. Standard error is more commonly used to quantify the precision and reliability of sample mean estimates and make statistical inferences based on sample data. Whereas, standard deviation is more commonly used to describe and compare the spread or variability of different datasets or within a single dataset. Standard error can be estimated using sample data to assess the precision of the sample mean estimate and the variability of sample means that would be obtained from repeated sampling. Whereas, standard deviation can be estimated using historical data, observed data, or data collected from a sample to provide insights into the variability of a larger population or dataset. The value of standard error is always positive, as it represents a measure of precision or variation in sample means. Whereas, the value of standard deviation is always positive, as it represents a measure of spread or variability from the mean. Standard error is based on the sample data and is used to estimate the variability of sample means and the precision of sample mean estimate. Whereas, standard deviation does not require knowledge of the population parameters and can be calculated solely based on the available dataset. In short, standard error is often used in conjunction with sample mean estimates, confidence intervals, and hypothesis tests to draw inferences and make statistical judgments about the population based on sample data. Whereas, standard deviation is often used in conjunction with other statistical measures and tests to gain a comprehensive understanding of the data distribution and variability. Kindly subscribe my YouTube channel Thesis Helper. Thanks for watching.